Only one non-Soviet nuclear power ever willingly surrendered its nuclear weapons. That state was the Republic of South Africa. But why did South Africa have nukes in the first place? Why did the South Africans get rid of their nukes? And what if South Africa actually used their nukes? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so subscribe and stay tuned. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's donated to us on Patreon, Utreon, and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Your donations really go a long way to keeping this channel going, and by donating to us across any of these platforms, you'll get access to some great perks including physical merch, a custom designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos. You can follow the pop-up on screen here, go to the comment section or description to visit any of these pages and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video. The South African nuclear weapons program began in earnest in the late 1960s under the guidance of then Prime Minister and future President John Vorster. By this point in time, the South Africans had already begun making use of nuclear power via the Safari 1 and Coburg nuclear reactors. South Africa, being rich in uranium, was able to explore wider uses for nuclear power, including for mining purposes. However, those wider uses may have simply been a cover for South Africa's true ambitions of weapon development. For the South Africans, nuclear weapons weren't merely a matter of participation in the Cold War. Yes, South Africa was technically a part of the Western Bloc, but there were significant ideological divides between it and the United States. While the nuclearization of Britain and France served a Cold War agenda aimed at deterring the Soviet Union, South Africa's motives were more similar to those of Israel. Faced with the existential threat of hostile states on all sides and an internal native population hostile to its ruling settler population in a time of global polarization and frequent violence, South Africa, like Israel, saw a nuclear deterrent as the only means by which it could secure the existence of its people in the long term. Israel likely recognized a shared struggle with South Africa, as despite South African assertions that it developed its weapons with no outside help, Israeli officials have come forward claiming that the two countries had collaborated on weapon development. Both countries felt isolated and vulnerable. In the case of South Africa, the United States had placed sanctions upon them since 1963, and increasingly South Africa faced internal pressure by militant forces attempting to overthrow the apartheid system. See, the United States during the Cold War was driven not merely by anti-communism, but by concepts of Western liberalism, democratization, and freedom. Concepts which were once considered overly idealistic by many Western powers, but which in the aftermath of the Great Wars became widely accepted by the battered states of Europe. South Africa and Israel were insulated from this by their circumstances, never being in secure enough a position from local populations to embrace Western liberalism, but also never being under direct enough threat by the Soviet Union to concede to American desires. Much like Rhodesia, South Africa was pressured by the international community to democratize its elections by granting majority rule, despite the fact that this would demand of the settler population that they intentionally disadvantage themselves and be left with scant representation in government. Such a change would have utterly altered the character of the country as well, turning it into something entirely different. Thus, South Africa remained a pariah to the West and saw self-reliance as the only direction it could follow. Domestically, the South African government also needed to contend with militant communist and black nationalist forces like Nelson Mandela's ANC, which began a campaign of terrorist attacks against South Africa beginning in 1961. Only some years later, in 1966, the South African border war would break out, giving the South African government an even larger insurgency to contend with, and eventually driving them into indirect conflict with Cuba once the Cubans began their intervention in the Angolan Civil War, which spilled over into Southwest Africa, what we today know as Namibia. Eventually, this combination of international pressures, wars, and domestic insurgencies forced the South African government to concede. Under the leadership of F.W. de Klerk, the Mikhail Gorbachev of South Africa, majority rule was granted, Namibia gained independence, and over the next 3 decades the country would descend deeper into a chasm of violence, corruption, and poverty. But this time, things are different. With the fall of the Portuguese government during the Carnation Revolution, Angola was granted independence, but almost immediately saw itself descend into civil war. In our timeline, South Africa took it upon itself to support anti-communist rebels within Angola to secure their own western provinces that bordered it and had their own communist insurgencies which they had been in the process of suppressing. In this alternate timeline, Vorster recognizes that if a foreign power were to intervene, suppressing the insurgency in the region would become untenable and so would need a more impactful deterrent. In our own timeline, then Minister of Defense P.W. Botha had believed that a victory for the communist MPLA in Angola was inevitable, and in this alternate timeline would advise against wasting resources in Angola, insisting that the United States, who had been encouraging South Africa to involve themselves, take on the burden. Instead, South Africa would move to evacuate its civilian populations out of northern Namibia, allowing the communist PLAN forces to consolidate in the north. Although this would have allowed PLAN to link up with the MPLA, it would have also given them clearly defined borders and allowed their leadership to emerge from hiding. Months later, using MPLA involvement in Southwest Africa as a pretense, South Africa would drop its first atomic weapon on a major population center within insurgency territory, a weapon with a yield similar to that of the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. This would be only one of 6 nuclear weapons they would have had at their disposal, that number not being public knowledge at the time, and would warn all neighboring governments that supporting insurgencies within South Africa would be tantamount to a declaration of war. Spectators around the world would be in shock. South Africa had become the first country to ever nuke itself in an act of war. There would certainly be international backlash, but the murkiness of nuclear weapons during the Cold War would leave many in debate over if or not South Africa's actions were justified. A UN court opinion in 1996 vaguely states that, quote, international customary and treaty law does not contain any specific prescription authorizing the threat or use of nuclear weapons or any other weapon in general, or in certain circumstances, in particular those of the exercise of legitimate self-defense. Nor, however, is there any principle or rule of international law which would make the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons or any other weapons dependent upon the specific authorization. State practice shows that the illegality of the use of certain weapons as such does not result from an absence of authorization, but on the contrary is formulated in terms of prohibition. It does not seem to the court that the use of nuclear weapons can be regarded as specifically prohibited on the basis of certain provisions of the Second Hague Declaration of 1899, the regulations annexed to the Hague Convention of 1907, or the 1925 Geneva Protocol. The pattern until now has been for weapons of mass destruction to be declared illegal by specific instruments, but the court does not find any specific prohibition of recourse to nuclear weapons in treaties expressly prohibiting the use of certain weapons of mass destruction, and observes that although in the last 2 decades a great many negotiations have been concluded regarding nuclear weapons, they have not resulted in a treaty of general prohibition of the same kind as for bacteriological and chemical weapons. As to treaties and also to declarations made in connection with the indefinite extension of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, it emerges from these instruments that 1. A number of states have undertaken not to use nuclear weapons in specific zones, Latin America and the South Pacific, or against certain other states, and 2. Nevertheless, even within this framework, the nuclear weapon states have reserved the right to use nuclear weapons in certain circumstances. South Africa's actions would not have only fallen into a gray zone, but could have even been defended to the international community as an act of self-defense, meaning the South African government wouldn't face any direct repercussions from the UN. However, individual states could be expected to fully cut ties with South Africa and advocate for a changing of the regime and denuclearization. The already isolated country would accept this fate and take on the role of a hermit kingdom, isolating itself from the world in a fashion akin to North Korea. Of South Africa's few remaining allies, Israel would have been the most prominent and capable, recognizing that it would have done the same thing if ever it came under heavy invasion, a strategy some have come to refer to as the Samson option. South Africa's neighbors, intimidated by this show of strength, would be forced to arrest and hand over the leadership and soldiers of anti-South African militant groups operating within their borders. MPLA, concerned with its own success in Angola, would distance itself from PLAN, allowing the South African Defense Force to gradually retake the whole of Namibia and pacify rebel lands. Depending upon when this occurred, the South Africans may find another ally in the fellow pariah state of Rhodesia, who was in a similar but more dire struggle to maintain minority rule. Given the security offered by South Africa, the stability of their ruling settler population, and the strength of their domestic economy, the Rhodesia of this timeline may revive an earlier proposal for a union between the two countries, a union which, if it were to be established, would have surrounded the at times hostile but relatively wealthy state of Botswana on all sides, and forced it to cooperate. Difficult circumstances would drive South Africa to adopt more militaristic and authoritarian practices, attempting to keep out foreign influence as the United States soon became the chief backer of resistance movements against South Africa's government, especially in the post-Cold War period. Desperate to preserve its security from foreign intervention, South Africa would continue to develop nuclear weapons along with delivery systems for them. During the border war, South Africa was forced to rely on bomber planes to deliver its weapons, but by the end of the Cold War would have developed ballistic missile systems capable of reaching the other nuclear powers, making it a matter of chief concern for the West now that the threat of the Soviet Union had passed. But what do you think? What might have happened had South Africa used its nuclear weapons? Let us know in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.
You cannot burn me! I do not have time to combust!